Welcome back once again to more human physiology. So let's go ahead and start discussing what it is that we as humans need in order to survive. Now, ordinarily, this is the sort of thing that I would do as kind of an in-class activity. Basically, have my students just list out all the things that you think we need in order to survive. Again, this is the sort of thing that I would usually make kind of an interactive activity. A little harder to do when I'm pre-recording a video, but at this point you might want to just pause the video and just maybe on a piece of paper, just write down all the things that you think a human might need in order to survive, and then after you're done with that, go ahead and restart the video. So, of all the things we need in order to stay alive, we can break them down into 4 general classes. Now, the first thing is really not so much a class as it is something very specific. So, oxygen. So, the air that we breathe contains oxygen. It's not mostly oxygen. Nitrogen is 78 to 80% of the air that we breathe, but really it's that 21% oxygen that it contains that is going to be most important to us. So, as you learned in general biology, and as we'll just kind of briefly review in Chapter 3, ATP production by cells and in the mitochondria is going to be most efficient when oxygen is plentifully available to us. So without oxygen, we make about 16 to 18 times less oxygen than we would if oxygen was available to us. So if we don't have oxygen, we are still making ATP, we're just not making very much of it. Now, that's going to be a big problem because certain organs and tissues in our body require an extraordinary amount of ATP in order to function, meaning that a lot of what they do is anabolic reactions. Now, which organs or tissues do you think are kind of going to need oxygen the most? So you might already have some preconceived notions. So some common answers I might get to this question are things like the brain and the heart. So we understand the consequences of these organs not getting enough oxygen, because if there is an obstruction in, say, the carotid artery that takes oxygen-rich blood to the brain, or the coronary arteries which bring oxygen-rich blood to the cardiac muscle of the heart, you're talking about the sorts of things that lead to strokes and heart attacks. And then also, skeletal muscle requires a lot of oxygen as well. So the fact that these things require so much oxygen tells you just how much of an energy demand these tissues and these organs are under. So again, we will review cellular respiration a little bit more in chapters 2 and 3, but that's basically it. You need oxygen in order to make the absolute most amount of ATP you possibly can. So number 2 here, this is kind of a more broad category, nutrients. So a nutrient is a substance that has to be ingested, eaten, or drank in order to sustain life. So like I said, this is kind of a broad, vague term. So we can break it down into 3 kind of components. So the first is water. You don't really tend to think of water as a nutrient, but given the definition we just formed for nutrients, it certainly applies. So all those anabolic and catabolic reactions that we talked about earlier, that we need in order to sustain life, all of those reactions have to take place in a water-based medium, which again is our bodily fluids, our intracellular and extracellular fluids. So we need to maintain a constant internal concentration of water in order for these types of things to be maintained. And then also water is a critical part of the body's cooling process, as we kind of discussed earlier when we talked about what happens in homeostasis when your body temperature gets a little too high. So food molecules are more appropriately energy-yielding substrates. So food molecules like carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, the types of molecules that are fodder for catabolic reactions, these molecules are very rich in energy, and digestion is going to break them down into simpler building blocks, and then the difference in energy gets converted to ATP through cellular respiration. We already talked about all that with catabolic reactions. And then the third category of nutrients here are what are called micronutrients. So things like vitamins and minerals. So the idea here is that micronutrients are not really used for energy, right? So we don't break them down and extract energy out of them in the same way we do actual food molecules. So micronutrients are not so much about actually providing energy themselves. They are in some way either necessary or required for particular metabolic reactions. Now, a perfect example of this is the disease scurvy. Now, scurvy, definitely not as much a problem today as it was, say, back in the 1400s, 1500s, kind of the age of exploration when people were on ships crossing the Atlantic for months on end. So scurvy was all about, and I'm sure you already know this, scurvy was all about a vitamin C deficiency. Now, they didn't know that at the time because obviously they had no idea how simple it was to fix this and to prevent. So eventually someone got wise and figured out that, okay, we can prevent scurvy if we just make sure that everyone on the boat eats lots of citrus fruits like oranges and things of that nature. So what vitamin C is a micronutrient. Again, we don't actually get any energy out of it. What vitamin C is absolutely essential for is the synthesis of a structural protein called collagen. Now, collagen is a very important protein. It's a part of the skin and of all sorts of connective tissues throughout the body. So vitamin C is absolutely necessary for the synthesis of collagen, and scurvy is basically a disease caused by the halting of the process of collagen synthesis. So not that I really recommend it, but you can do a Google image search for what someone going through scurvy looks like. It is not pleasant, so that's why I don't really recommend it. So here's a question for you just to kind of review some of the things that we've talked about. Is the synthesis of collagen, again, that's a protein, is the synthesis of a protein like collagen, is that an anabolic reaction or is it a catabolic reaction? So that's definitely a question for you to kind of ponder and maybe go backwards in the slides a little bit if you are having trouble finding the answer to that. So aside from oxygen and nutrients, the next thing is going to be a narrow range of temperature. Now, this might not necessarily be on your list of things that you put together, but it's sort of obvious. It almost doesn't need to be said in kind of extreme cases, right? So we obviously can't live on the surface of the sun, and we can't live on Pluto where the temperature is negative whatever many degrees. I'm not an astronomer, so I don't want to put a definitive number on that because I'd probably be very wrong and look very silly, right? So we need to live in a narrow range of temperature. Now, we can live as low as, say, negative 20 degrees. We can live as high as, say, 120 degrees, right? So it's not pleasant, but we can survive for a little while in there. So a narrow range of temperature is really all about the enzymes in your cells. So what the heck is an enzyme? If you don't remember that from general biology, enzymes are usually proteins. They're basically little metabolic machines that make your metabolic reactions go much, much, much more quickly. So they are going to facilitate the types of catabolic and anabolic reactions that we talked about previously. Now, enzymes are very, very, very good for us, but they are very, very sensitive to changes in temperature. Now, if you consider what your core body temperature is, which is 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, it just so happens that that is the absolute perfect temperature that enzymes prefer. So if we look at this graph of enzyme activity as a function of changes in temperature, you will notice that the enzyme reaches peak activity right at 37 degrees Celsius. Any cooler than that, and we experience a drop-off in activity. The main reason for that is that the colder things get, molecules start moving around much more slowly, and naturally chemical reactions are going to slow down. But the question is, why can't we just warm things up and up and up and up and see an increase in catabolic and anabolic efficiency, right? Well, it is true that as you crank up the temperature, molecules do start moving faster and faster and faster. But if you crank up the temperature too much, enzymes are going to basically fall apart on you. So that process of an enzyme losing its function because of too high of a temperature or something else, that is called denaturation. So once an enzyme becomes denatured, it completely falls apart and it is going to permanently lose its function. And then at that point, your metabolic reaction is basically going to stop altogether. So that's kind of a bad deal. So again, if you think about this in terms of some of the homeostasis principles we kind of briefly discussed before, you can hopefully appreciate how very important it is that we keep our body temperature as close to 37 degrees Celsius as we possibly can. It's all about keeping our enzymes nice and happy so that our catabolic and anabolic reactions can happen as efficiently as they possibly can. And don't forget, catabolic and anabolic reactions are tied into that ATP synthesis that we talked about before. So you definitely don't want to do anything to make ATP synthesis happen more slowly. And then we've also discussed how sweating and shivering are your body's kind of natural homeostatic mechanisms for responding to deviations from that 37 degree set point. So we don't want those changing too much. So thankfully, we have ways of dealing with being out in the cold or out in the heat to keep that core body temperature right where the enzymes want them. So before we get to the last kind of requirement for human life, just something kind of an interesting little clinical application of the narrow range and temperature aspect. So as we discussed, when the body is at 37 degrees Celsius, you've got your enzymes working at max efficiency, and therefore the tissues are going to require a lot of ATP energy. There's kind of a trade-off there. If your body temperature is right where it should be, your body's going to be happy, but it's also going to be at the max in terms of how much energy do we need. So this means that if you are at 37 degrees, you are at your maximum need for oxygen delivery from the blood. Now, there are certainly a lot of clinical, especially surgical scenarios in which blood flow to a particular organ has to stop, particularly something like open heart surgery. You cannot do open heart surgery on a heart that is still beating. You have to stop the heart and then do the surgery in order to fix a valve or something like that. Now, the issue here is that if you stop the heart, the blood stops circulating as well. Well, we can solve that issue fairly easily. In those cases, they tend to use a pump to actually circulate the blood artificially. But the problem there is that the heart and certain other organs are going to experience just less blood flow than they did before. So that's kind of a problem. Less blood flow means less oxygen delivery, meaning that if we're at 37 degrees Celsius, that can be a little bit of a problem. So in cases like that, we can get kind of clever and induce what is called controlled hypothermia. Basically, you put a whole bunch of ice on the patient to lower their core body temperature, which seems like kind of a bad thing, but when you lower the core body temperature, because you are decreasing the efficiency of those enzymes, you are also decreasing how much oxygen and how much nutrients from the blood those organs and those tissues need, so they can more easily tolerate that lack of blood flow for longer than they would ordinarily at 37 degrees Celsius. Just kind of an interesting little application there. Okay, and then finally, this one probably wouldn't be on your list. I'd be really impressed if it was. So this isn't something that you really ever think about because we're always living near atmospheric pressure. You really would have to go looking and adventuring to find yourself in a place that is not right at atmospheric pressure. So as we're going to discover later in the semester when we start talking about the respiratory system, the atmospheric pressure, meaning the pressure on the air that is all around us, that's going to play a critical role in breathing mechanics. How do we get air to come into the lungs? How do we push air out? So on top of that, atmospheric pressure, which is about 1 atmosphere or 760 millimeters mercury around sea level, that's going to help to keep gases dissolved in your bodily fluids. So there's plenty of reasons here why we want the pressure around us to be right near that 760 millimeters mercury. But like I said, in order for that to not be the case, you really are going to have to go adventuring. You're really going to have to either climb a mountain or dive deep down in the sea. So perfect example of this, if we use the latter as an example, decompression sickness. So this is the result of gases in your blood, usually nitrogen just because of how abundant it is in the air that we breathe. These gases start coming out of solution because of the immense pressure that is placed on your body when you dive deep down into the sea. So the undissolved nitrogen becomes gaseous bubbles. Again, they come out of solution, so they become an actual bubble as a gas, and this is going to cause all types of problem for the affected person. Again, another application of what goes wrong when we do not satisfy these requirements. All right, so that is going to do it for this particular video. So the next video, which is going to focus on homeostasis, is probably going to be a little bit of a longer one. It's kind of the major focus of this particular chapter. So I hope you'll look forward to it, and I will see you next time.